So did everybody get something to eat? Probably? Okay. Hey guys. I didn't used to do this in court. These are some of my colleagues, my former colleagues at the Institute for Justice. And Justin, I have to note right off the beginning, just rung up the state of Florida for a sweet price tag in a commercial speech case, so congratulations to you. So I'm Clark Neily. I'm at the CATO Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C. I recently made the transition from doing constitutional litigation with my friends at the Institute for Justice to doing criminal justice work, which I've never done before. I've never been a prosecutor. I've never been a criminal defense attorney. And I spent the last 17 years doing constitutional litigation. And there was something I saw when I was doing that work towards the end that made me incredibly concerned about our criminal justice system. And what I was working on was something called civil forfeiture. Who's heard of civil forfeiture before? That is amazing. So about 4 or 5 years ago, when I first started working on civil forfeiture, I set up a Google search. And I would probably get something like 2 or 3 hits a week 5 years ago on civil forfeiture. And I get, you guys have searches set up at all?
Not me personally, but I do.
So I get between 6 and 10 hits a day now on civil forfeiture. And it's like everybody's talking about it, and everybody seems to know about it. Can anybody just really quickly tell me what civil forfeiture is or what you understand it to be? Yeah.
Authorities can seize a defendant's assets without proof of guilt.
Yeah, that's very succinctly put. So there's 2 kinds of forfeiture. There's criminal, which is I think what most of us think about, and that's where the government asserts that you were engaged in criminal activity. They prove that, or either they prove it in court or you plead guilty to it, and then they show that particular property was connected to that crime in some way and they get to keep it. Civil forfeiture is much different. Civil forfeiture doesn't require a criminal conviction. They don't even have to charge you. All they do is assert. All the police have to do is assert that some property of yours, it could be your car, your home, a boat, or just some money that you happen to have on you, was involved in criminal activity of some kind. Does anybody know what probable cause means? So there's 2, you're laughing. Why are you laughing?
Well, it varies depending on who your judge is.
No, it's exactly right. That is exactly the point I was looking for. So there's probable cause as it's described in law books, and then there's probable cause in real life, which is nothing. It's nothing. It's a hunch. Does anybody know what a PCC dog is? You probably call it a drug sniffing dog. It's actually a probable cause creating dog. That dog is trained to come to your car, sniff your car, and do what?
Yeah.
I've never seen it, but I think it looks like this. They alert. And that alert alone is probable cause to search your car. And if they find something in there, like a bunch of cash, and that happened to an Institute for Justice client in Oklahoma. He was actually the manager of a Burmese Christian rock band, believe it or not, there is such a thing. They were over here in the States raising money for an orphanage in Thailand. And they were doing concerts and they were selling CDs, and it was all very informal. It was just cash at the gate. And he was taking a break. They were taking a break in the concert tour. He was driving back from Iowa to his home in Dallas, and he got stopped for a busted taillight in Muskogee, Oklahoma. It is always a busted taillight. I don't know why, but it's always a busted taillight or speed. And they asked him if he had any cash in the car, and he said yes. And he actually had an envelope in his center console with $53,000 in it. And they immediately got suspicious, and he said, "Oh no, I'm the manager of this band." And he actually had CDs from the band, like with his picture on it, which is pretty forward thinking if you're a drug dealer trying to cover up, drug activity. And they wouldn't believe him. So they brought a PCC dog to the car, who alerted, and on that basis they took the money. And they even filed felony drug charges against him, notwithstanding the fact they didn't find any drugs in the car. That was all about keeping that money. And so I worked on these forfeiture cases for several years at IJA, and what I was struck by 2 things. First, the incredible sloppiness. Just to give you one fact. So there's state forfeiture and there's federal forfeiture. You would probably think that the feds they would have you believe that they're the really, really, top level, most professional, most competent. They hire the best people, the smartest people. I actually verified this. I don't know if you guys even know this. I verified this with a couple of my colleagues who run our forfeiture work at IJ. I still say our because I feel like we're cousins. And they want to guess what IJ's win-loss rate is in federal forfeiture action. So again, this is us, this is IJ up against the very best in the country, the U.S. Attorney, the Department of Justice and U.S. Attorney's Office. What do you think?
100%.
It's 100%.
Yeah.
It's 100%. I don't know how many of you actually got out and worked in the real world yet, like in maybe a public defender's office, or maybe you've worked in a lawyer's office. There is no field of the law in which anybody should ever have a 100% win rate. Something is wrong if you have a 100% win rate. And what's wrong in this area is the extraordinarily cavalier attitude and approach of the government in these forfeiture cases. They will absolutely assure you that they have procedures in place, and they're all really good people, and that stuff you described would never happen in this office, and yet we had a 100% win rate against the federal government. The other thing that struck me is I began to worry, I mean literally lie awake at night in bed, wondering to myself, if these guys are that sloppy when it comes to taking somebody's car or their home, are they that sloppy when it comes to putting somebody in a cage? Could you redo that, please, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah! Yes, they are. And that began to really upset me as a professional public interest lawyer, as an American citizen, as somebody who was taught to believe that our Constitution is unique in the world in terms of the protections that it provides and the system of government that it creates. It began to really bother me that it might be the case that we operate our criminal justice system as cavalierly and as sloppily as we do the civil forfeiture work that I had litigated at the Institute for Justice. And the more I thought about it, the more I read up on it, the more I looked into it, the more convinced I became that, in fact, our criminal justice system is deeply problematic. And I have come to the conclusion that actually we have two criminal justice systems in America. We have the one that's described in our Constitution and mythologized to us as a people and taught to our children in schools, and then we have the one that actually operates in real life. And what does that system do? Well, one thing it does is it achieves the world's highest incarceration rate at rock bottom prices. Does anybody know what America's incarceration rate is? It's the highest in the world. It's about 700 people per 100,000. You know what Cuba's is? It's about 500. So we're beating Cuba in something, right? Canada, I haven't looked recently, it's about 220, something like that. We're off the charts. And it seems to me there's a couple of conclusions that we can draw from this. One possibility is that Americans are, in fact, the most criminal people in the world. And thank goodness for us, we're locking each other up at about the right rate. Another possibility is that all countries, basically criminality is roughly equivalent in different countries. I mean, we know it's worse in some countries, but let's say in developed countries, and we just happen to be really good at it. We've got a very efficient law enforcement system and an efficient criminal justice system, and we're just we're good at stuff. We put a man on the moon, we invented the cotton gin, and we're just really good at putting people in prison. I think that's what most people in law enforcement have us believe, that we just happen to do this really well. We're very conscientious. I actually think there's a third explanation, and it's somewhat complicated, but I think it's almost certainly correct, and that is this. One thing that we do is we have a legislative process that essentially just creates new crimes all the time. It's like an open fire hydrant. State and federal legislatures are just spraying out new crimes all the time. And the first and most fundamental problem, I think, with our criminal justice system is we have a judiciary that has literally no idea how to evaluate the question of whether the government needs a good reason to put somebody in a cage. You would think so, and if you asked a judge or even a Supreme Court justice that question in the abstract, they would probably say, oh yes, obviously yes. But what they've done is they've created a constitutional doctrine that says no. The government doesn't need a good reason to put somebody in a cage, and let me give you an example. Back in the late 1800s, they had a kind of an early form of prohibition, right? We had alcohol prohibition that started in 1920 and then it went to 1933. Why was it so short? Why did we only have 13 years of alcohol prohibition? It was a disaster. It was a complete disaster. It increased criminal activity, the homicides went up, violent crime went up, everybody kept drinking, it was just a complete disaster. We had actually an earlier form of prohibition in this country, and I'll bet you guys don't even know what I'm thinking of. Do you remember margarine prohibition? No, because it was stupid and old-timey. But no kidding, actually in the late 1800s, a French chemist invented margarine, and it turned out to be a cheap substitute for butter, and when it got over here to the United States, a certain industry freaked out. Who would that be? Dairy. You bet, the dairy industry. And suddenly, they're losing customers, right? So actually, some states went so far as to criminalize the sale of listen. I'm getting there. Criminalize the sale of margarine. And there were two explanations, or two possible explanations. One was the explanation that the state of Pennsylvania gave, which is the state I'm about to talk about, and that is that margarine is deadly poison and might also turn you into a werewolf. Now, I'm going to have the second one, but they did say it was really unhealthy. The second possibility is that this is just nothing more than caving into dairy industry lobbying, which is obviously correct, I think. Anyway, two gentlemen were arrested in Pennsylvania for selling margarine. And they did something, I think, very smart. It kind of warms the cockles of my lawyer heart, which is that they offered to introduce expert testimony, that the factual premise of the law was false, that in fact margarine is not particularly unhealthy, certainly not compared to butter. The trial court judge excluded that evidence on the grounds that it was irrelevant. Think about that for a minute. What if the state had asserted that margarine turns people into werewolves, and you offered to prove that in fact that's not true? Would that also have been irrelevant? That's a really important and interesting question. And this went all the way to the US Supreme Court, which said in 1888 case called Powell versus Pennsylvania, the trial court is correct, this is completely irrelevant. And the state can criminalize whatever the hell it wants. Wow. Wow. If you make a mistake that fundamental at the beginning, in other words, that the government doesn't need a good reason for putting somebody in jail because they were selling margarine or books or a plant that makes people hungry and happy. None of our business. You are going to make so many other errors downstream from that one because you're missing the whole point right from the beginning. Let me ask you a question. If the government banned Harry Potter books tomorrow, federal crime to possess or to sell a Harry Potter book, do you think this number would go up or down? Think it would go up? You don't think people would just say, well, I guess that's so much for Harry Potter books. I guess it's Game of Thrones.
I think so.
So they would keep doing it. Notwithstanding the fact, I mean, aren't these good, patriotic Americans? Why would they be flaunting the law like that?
No reason to do it.
Yeah.
Just because you make something illegal doesn't mean that you will destroy the demand for it.
Oh, please say that again louder.
Just because you make something illegal does not mean you will destroy the demand for it. Mercatus-centered thinking.
No, we don't have to drag those guys into it. We just look around and you know it. Just because you make something illegal doesn't mean people will stop wanting it, and it doesn't mean people will stop trying to get it. So this number is going to go up. I think what we would see is a brief spike, and then I think we'd see it go back down. Why? Who might get involved if we ban the sale of a book in America? I'll give you a hint. He wears a robe. He's got a little hammer made out of wood. Sometimes he's a sheep. Anybody? Yeah. And would we all freak out if judges got involved and struck down this law? No, we would think what? God bless you guys, that's America. Banning books is not America. I don't think banning margarine is America, we'll put that to the side. But banning books is not America. Striking down laws that ban books, that's America, right? So the question then arises, does that apply anywhere else? Would we expect judges to get off the bench and get involved if the government banned the sale of other stuff, or is it just books? Anybody? Well, if you figure that one out, you are basically eligible for a direct ride to the Supreme Court because you actually understand more than the Supreme Court. In 200 years, they have not bothered to answer this question in any meaningful way, and I wrote a book about it. Our judiciary is completely at sea. If the state of California tomorrow made it illegal to consume or possess beer or hard alcohol, but wine is still fine, do you have any idea why I might do that? That's not that much different than the margarine example, is it? And do you think our judiciary would just sit there and say, I don't know. Okay, well, guess what? I just described our drug policy, at least some of it. If you think about it, if you look at the social science data, if you look at the health data, alcohol is a far more destructive drug than marijuana. And I'm not here pushing for legalization of marijuana, I'm just talking about science. If you had to pick one substance to outlaw, marijuana or alcohol, it would be a no-brainer if you really cared about people. And we got it exactly backwards. And what do? We create criminals. That's what's going on here, in my opinion. It's not that we have the most criminal people in the world. It's not that we have the most efficient law enforcement in the world. It's that we create criminals. We make them. We make them by enacting laws that criminalize things that people want to do. And I actually don't think there's much difference between, for example, outlawing marijuana on the one hand and outlawing Harry Potter books on the other. People want to read Harry Potter, they're going to get it. People want to smoke marijuana or ingest it or do whatever they do with it. It's not my thing. I'm not high and mighty, I'm really into cocktails, just putting it out there. And if we had alcohol prohibition again, I would definitely go to jail. So that's the first point I wanted to make about overcriminalization. I wanted to make a very precise point that I hope that all of you as law students and we as lawyers can be very clear about so we can communicate this point to other people who might not be in a position to appreciate it. And that is, we have a government that has actually created criminals by enacting laws where society has nothing at stake. And let me give you a thought experiment. This is a little dangerous, but bear with me. If George Bush and Barack Obama showed up and beat a reporter to death on the front yard of the White House, do you think they'd be prosecuted?
Probably not.
Don't be cynical. Do you think they'd be prosecuted? No? Okay, then it's not Barack Obama. How about Jake Tapper on CNN? So the point is this. I can see this thought experiment's going nowhere because you're too cynical. I actually do think, by the way, I think a former president would be prosecuted for killing a person in cold blood. I really do. Does anybody seriously not think that? If a former president killed somebody in cold blood on national TV, you don't think he'd be prosecuted? Let me just assure you that they would. What I don't think would happen is if, for example, President Obama reverted to some of his high school hobbies and started smoking weed again. Maybe even sold a little weed in his Calorama neighborhood where he lives now. It's a really nice neighborhood. I think drug dealers would stand out. It would probably be a market. You'd probably have a real market niche if you could be a former president and provide people with their needs. I actually don't think he'd be prosecuted. I think it's relatively certain that he would not be prosecuted. And I think the reason for that is that the people in charge of making that decision understand that there is nothing at stake for society in this area. There's a lot at stake for society in making sure that murderers and other violent criminals go to jail. And I don't think that just being some exalted former politician would save you. But I'm absolutely certain that being an exalted former politician would save you from a drug charge. And I think that's because everybody on some level, whether they admit it or not, basically gets that when it comes to some criminal laws, we have a lot at stake. And other criminal laws, we have nothing whatsoever at stake. I'll tell you what, I'm actually thinking about running this as an experiment, so I'll get back to you with the results if I do it. But I think the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is what this does to the relationship between citizens and police in certain communities. Because I really think that people who live in those communities understand perfectly well that police are enforcing laws, and sometimes very aggressively enforcing laws, in which society has literally nothing at stake. Let me give you another thought experiment. What do you suppose would happen to the drug war if the Department of Justice took 1/2 of the resources that it currently devotes to drug interdiction in the inner cities and devoted those resources to drug interdiction in college dormitories? How about Ivy League college dormitories? Do you think we have the stomach to send the children of doctors and lawyers and politicians to jail for 10 or 20 years for conspiring to distribute controlled substances? I don't. I'm quite confident that we don't. I think there's a very good reason why the only reason we wage the drug war is against the inner cities primarily and people without political power. Because there is nothing at stake for society, and we know it. And one way you know that we know it is we don't wage that war against people who we don't have the stomach to incarcerate. I think that's an indictment of the system. I mean, to the extent that you agree with me, you think it's true, I think that's a real indictment of the system. And I think people who are suffering the brunt of those enforcement efforts in the inner cities and other places understand very well what's going on. They are bearing the brunt of an enforcement effort, of a war on drugs, that would be intolerable if it was aimed at other elements in society, and they resent it. And some of you may know people in that situation. You may know that they resent it, and they pay for it. They pay for it with their lives. They pay for it in ruined lives. People go to jail. Children grow up without fathers, sometimes without mothers, usually fathers. And the people who get processed through that system come out, and their prospects are terrible. It's hard to get a job. Recidivism is high because you can't support yourself. And we just sort of create this perpetual cycle of criminality under circumstances where we have nothing at stake. And it's wrong. It's morally wrong. And it's messing us up as a country. We could do so much better. There's absolutely no need to be doing this to ourselves, but we are. I want to touch on a part of the system that I think, again, that we as lawyers and about to be lawyers are particularly well equipped to appreciate. And I hope I can inspire some of you to think hard about this and maybe go out and do something about it. I will tell you candidly that I have not figured out what to do about this, and it troubles me greatly. And this is what I'm talking about. If you look at the Constitution and you look at the criminal procedure provisions in the Constitution, and actually our Constitution devotes more ink to the subject of criminal procedure than any other single subject. Let's remark on that for a moment. We have the most guidance from the founders about criminal procedure than any other subject. And if you look at that, what they said about it, you cannot miss the fact that the criminal jury trial is at the very heart of our system. And that makes us different than most other countries because we put citizen participation at the very heart of our criminal justice system. We do it in the form of a criminal jury trial. If you look at what we're doing in real life, where's the criminal jury trial now? It's almost completely absent. 97% of federal criminal convictions are obtained through plea bargain. 95 to 96% of criminal convictions at the state level are obtained through plea bargain. Almost nobody goes to trial anymore. Do you think that's because criminal defendants don't want to go to trial? They just don't want to be in front of a jury of their peers? They have no interest in seeing if the government has met all of its procedural obligations? I know. What if you wanted to completely eliminate the criminal jury trial in this country, but you didn't want to amend the Constitution? How might you achieve that? Well, let me throw out a proposal. What if you made sure that the punishment that someone would suffer if they go to trial and lose is completely disproportionate to the magnitude of the crime? So they did something like they sold a bag of plant material that makes people hungry and happy. Maybe we give them a pat on the back for that. Maybe we give them a few months in jail. But instead, we make the mandatory minimum for that 2 years. And if you work together with somebody to distribute it, that's a conspiracy, and we'll give you 10. So we create penalties that are wildly disproportionate to the wrongfulness of the conduct. Then we might create a system that is so complex that individuals who are not lawyers have no hope of navigating it, so you need someone to help you. You need a lawyer. But then we'll make legal representation so expensive that ordinary people can't afford it. So then we'll provide you with a government-appointed lawyer, but we'll make sure that your public defender is so overworked and underpaid that they don't have time to devote more than a few hours to your case, and so effectively you're on your own. And then we'll equip prosecutors with a whole toolbox full of coercive techniques to put the screws to you and make you agree to a plea bargain. We'll allow them, for example, to stack charges. Does anybody know what charge stacking refers to? Has anybody ever heard that? It's when a prosecutor just keeps adding charges. You did something, maybe you stuck up a liquor store or something like that, but you held the door closed and there was somebody inside, so it's also kidnapping. And then you did something with a car, and so it's interstate, car theft or something. They just keep adding charges and adding charges and adding charges, trying to leverage a plea bargain. That's actually considered a violation of professional ethics in Great Britain. In America, it's business as usual. Another tool that prosecutors have. Do you know what would happen if you were a criminal defense attorney and you paid a witness money or gave them some other thing of value to come and testify on behalf of your client in a criminal trial? You go to jail. There's a federal law that says that's illegal. Do you know who gets to do that and does it all the time? You bet, prosecutors. What is the thing of value that prosecutors most often offer to a witness? Reduce time or reduce charges. Do you think there's any possibility that the concerns that animate federal law, the reason why we don't let criminal defense lawyers bribe witnesses, might equally apply to the other side of the equation when prosecutors are handing out reduced sentences? Absolutely. And they get to do it anyway. And it totally mystifies me. Then there's all these informal tools. I actually just learned of a term recently I'd never heard of before. It's called the trial penalty. Have you ever heard of the trial penalty? Trial penalty, yeah, you said yes?
Yeah, it's when you're negotiating a plea deal and the client doesn't take it, and then the prosecutor at trial is going to go for the max penalty even though he was only trying to get 2 or 3 months in a plea deal.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the trial penalty essentially is what the system does to you as a defendant if you presume to insist upon a trial. Because our system, we don't have the capacity to allow everybody that we indict to have a trial. We don't even have the capacity, I wouldn't guess we have the capacity to let 10% of people have trials. Trials are expensive and time consuming. And so what I've been told by my friends who are criminal defense attorneys is that there's this informal thing called the trial penalty, and everybody knows it. Prosecutors definitely impose it, and sometimes even judges. And it's just this whole network of things they can do to you if you insist upon a trial. You might get bad rulings at trial. The prosecutor might re-indict you on more serious charges. They might offer you a less of a good plea. They even can do things like go after your family or friends of yours who might have been involved in your criminal scheme or whatever. So I'm told this happens all the time. It's very much a part of our system. And what it all adds up to is we've created an extraordinarily coercive system of processing defendants. And I think that's basically what we do to achieve this number. We have essentially a giant wood chipper form of criminal justice that sucks in defendants and spits out convicts. And we've done it in a uniquely American way. We've taken something that we are incredibly good at as a country, and that is to take a complex and expensive process and make it really cheap. And that's exactly what we've done with criminal justice. I don't know what the cost per conviction should be in a minimally constitutional system where everybody who wants one gets a jury trial and you don't have all this coercion going on, but it would be pretty expensive because, you know, I mean, just to have 12 people take a day or a week or a month off from work is expensive. It ties up court time and so forth and so on. But if you look at the Constitution, again, you can't fail to miss that they were serious about this. Well, today we're totally not serious about this. And we have created a system. Oh, and by the way, remember when I gave this hypothetical about how we might go about achieving a 100% plea bargain rate? It wasn't hypothetical. I just described our criminal justice system. There was nothing I described that was hypothetical. I just described our criminal justice system. We do impose wildly disproportionate punishments on people that far exceed the wrongfulness of their conduct. We do have a complex system where ordinary people cannot afford their own lawyer. I was at a panel discussion last week where a sitting federal judge said that he had heard a credible estimate of an aggressive defense in a white-collar federal criminal prosecution. Anybody want to guess what his figure was? What do you think the cost of an aggressive defense in a federal white-collar criminal case might cost you? $2.5 million. It's higher. Guess again. Guess again. $20 million. $20 million. Anybody got that line right? Don't tell me if you do. That would be a whole different subject. But we don't have that lying around. So 80% of the people who go through the system have public defenders. In some places, they're very good. Federal public defenders are generally high quality. But in other places, they're just, whether they're good or not, they're overworked. They just don't have time. You don't really have a public defender, you have a public negotiator. And so all this adds up to a system that I think is deeply problematic. I have no idea where to rank our criminal justice system against other countries, and I'm not really that interested in where it ranks. What I'm interested in is whether our criminal justice system lives up to what we've been told about it. We've been told to believe that we have a criminal justice system that is very rigorous about ensuring that it has fair procedures, and that it has fairness and justice. And it has this, you may have heard this idea that, better that 10 guilty men go free than when an innocent man goes to prison. We are way off that mark. We don't know how many innocent people get convicted. There's a group called the Innocence Project that uses DNA to try to exonerate people who've been convicted of crimes. DNA is not perfect, but it's pretty close. So if someone's exonerated through DNA, you can be pretty confident that they didn't do any crime. About 10% of people who've been exonerated by the Innocence Project actually pled guilty to the crimes they went to prison for. So they pled guilty to crimes they didn't do. I have friends who are criminal defense attorneys who've told me that they have absolutely pled innocent people guilty because it was just the best deal for them. Everybody knows that happens, and everybody knows that it happens pretty routinely, and that's intolerable, and we shouldn't tolerate that. I wish I could tell you that I have a lot of solutions. I don't. I think we do need to get judges involved in at least making an effort to do what they would do, for example, if the government banned books, which is to say, look, you need a really good reason for that. And by the way, the government can ban books. I have my best friend is in D.C. is the head of litigation for the whole CIA. He has the best stories of anybody I know, and those are just the ones he can tell me. And I hound him all the time to write a memoir, because it would be awesome. But it would be illegal for him to publish that memoir without permission from his employer, because he's signed an agreement to that effect. So the government does have the ability to ban books, they just have to have a really good reason. And I can't for the life of me understand why the government shouldn't have to have a good reason to put people in cages when it's not a book. And that is absolutely Supreme Court, black letter Supreme Court precedent. You need a good reason to put somebody in a cage for selling a book. You don't need a good reason to put somebody in a cage for selling a plant or some non-dealer spread. And it's mind-boggling. So that's point one. That has to be fixed, because again, if you make that massive of a mistake at the beginning, you're going to get everything else wrong downstream, or a lot wrong downstream. What on earth do the procedures matter if you're getting the substance wrong right up front? I didn't talk a whole lot about policing, because I think that some of these problems, I think the problems we have with policing would be significantly mitigated if we stopped putting police in the position of having to enforce crimes where we have nothing at stake. What police should be focusing on are the crimes that everybody that come to mind when you think of crimes, violent crimes, homicide, rape, robbery, things like that. By the way, does anybody know what the clearance rate, the current national clearance rate for homicides is? How many cases are solved? It's about 62%. So you have about a 38% chance of getting away with murder in this country. And much higher if you do it in a place like Baltimore. In fact, I think you have about a 66% chance of getting away with murder in Baltimore. Why on earth do we have our police officers and other law enforcement focusing on things like consensual drug sales when we can't even clear half of murder, or when we're barely clearing half of murder cases? Other violent crimes, the clearance rate is less than 50%. For property crimes, it's less than 20%. Do they really have enough time to be enforcing these other laws? Well, that's what they're doing. So that's another thing that I would fix. I would try to make it, create a system in which police are going after laws that actually matter, and I think they would get along better with people if we had confidence that they were devoting their attention to laws that we really care about. I also want to get judges to start thinking about their role in imposing morally indefensible sentences. I think more judges should frankly be resigning. I had one come to CATO last week who stepped down after 6 years as a federal district judge. He stepped down and said, I will not do this anymore. I think more judges should think about doing that, or at least if they're not going to resign, about pushing back and simply saying, I will not be part of this. And then the last thing, this is the hardest nut, I think, to crack for all of us, and again, I invite you to enlist in this cause. I don't know if anything about our criminal justice system troubles me more than the fact that we've taken a system that was designed around the idea of citizen participation and we've eliminated it for all intents and purposes. I don't think we can really predict all the problems that would cause. What we do know is that the people who wrote our Constitution designed the criminal justice system with citizen participation at its very heart, and we've allowed prosecutors and to an extent judges to just throw citizens out of the process and keep them outside so they can't see what's going on and they can't provide feedback about what they're seeing. And I think that has been an absolute disaster, and we've got to change it. I will stop on that super upbeat note, and thank you for your attention. I want to apologize again for being late. I really appreciate your interest and your attention. I'd love to answer your questions that you might have. Anybody have a question? Yeah.
So you give the Harry Potter example, but it seems like some pushback you get from the left and the right is that's First Amendment jurisprudence.
Yep.
What constitutional provisions would you use? And also, what about the jurist's attitude, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, if my country wants to go to hell, it's my job to help them.
So I always modify that Oliver Wendell Holmes quote because he wasn't quite precise. What he really meant was, if you want to mess with him and send him to hell, it's my job to help you. No, that is actually everything we fought for in the Revolution. And there's this whole line of Western Enlightenment thinkers who spent most of their lives explaining what a morally bankrupt philosophy that is. That is absolutely the philosophy that we tried to get away from. That is certainly the philosophy that other countries have organized themselves around. And it's just a morally nihilistic philosophy. It's not ours. What I would say is this: what rights or what activities have constitutional protection beyond those that are specifically listed in the text of the Constitution, like free speech, is a challenging question. But I don't think that the initial question of whether we're going to protect, these are called unenumerated rights, is nearly as challenging as people like Robert Bork try to make it out to be. Let me give you one example. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. So I have a daughter, 2-year-old daughter. And if I were living in Virginia, where I am now, about 60 years ago, 70 years ago, if my daughter didn't test very well on the IQ, it's entirely possible somebody would show up to sterilize her. And there's nothing in the text of the Constitution about not having your reproductive organs ripped out by eugenicists, and they were eugenicists. What do you think I would do? Fight? Yeah. Yeah. I'd meet him with a gun. And they'd have to do it over my dead body. That's because I'm an American. And I don't look at the Constitution and say, hey, gee, did anybody think about not, oh no, there's nothing in here about not ripping out people's reproductive organs. Gee, I guess you just have to carry on. That's not the way a free people conducts itself. And we actually have the Ninth Amendment, of course, in the Bill of Rights. It says that the enumeration in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. I think the right to reproduce and not have your children's reproductive organs torn out by eugenicists is one that I would go to the mat for. This requires a lot of thought. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I think most Americans know in the kind of the marrow of their bones or the essence of their DNA that the Ninth Amendment plays an important role in our Constitution and not a trivial, insignificant role, which is what the Supreme Court says. It's probably as much as I can afford to say about it right now, but if you want to talk about it afterwards, this is actually one of my favorite subjects, and I appreciate you bringing it up. Anybody else have questions? Yeah.
Earlier you criticized the drug enforcement policies that we implement in the inner cities compared to, say, a dorm room, a college dorm room.
Yep.
To play devil's advocate, do you think the violent crime rates in the inner city play a role in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny, I just read a memo from one of my law clerks on that exact subject, and I asked her that question because she didn't address it very much. And so I think that's fair. In other words, if you had to choose where to devote police resources, and you've got a fairly peaceful drug distribution operation or a really violent one, I think it's reasonable to devote those resources there. But I think that to get credit, kind of credit for being reasonable, you have to take ownership of their very real possibility that that market is violent because of the policies that you yourself are enforcing. So you may have caused that violence, and you shouldn't, sort of absolve yourself of moral responsibility and just sort of go in there with, SWAT teams and guns blazing as if you had nothing to do with it.
That's a whole other debate, I guess.
It is, but I think it's an important one. Because I think we as a society tend to just take this attitude like, oh, you violent drug dealers, let's just come down on you with the full force of the state. My response is, oh, you did, and that's why it's so violent. That's my sense. In the back row, yeah.
So in your talk, you mentioned several times the public defenders. A few months ago, I watched, I think it was a TED Talk, it was a prosecutor talking about the same topic, and he was saying the same thing that you were mentioning, that they are overwhelmed, and the fastest thing is like just act, and just settle, and that's it. He was encouraging people to like a more educational approach.
Yep.
To overall, he worked with teenagers.
Yep.
Basically. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I'm clear on the question. What are my thoughts on sort of the situation of public defenders?
I think that the prosecutors should also be have less work, or
that prosecutors should?
Yeah.
No. Prosecutors, I think one of the myths we absolutely have to dispel is that prosecutors wear two hats. One is an advocate, and the other one is, sort of an officer of the court who has to do justice. We need to absolutely get past that. They are pure advocates, pure and simple. They are nothing else, and they have to be treated that way. And to have a system where we think, oh, well, you'll do the right thing, or you'll use your discretion to avoid injustices has been a terribly damaging mindset for our system. So we just have to understand that we have a fully adversarial system. I would advocate a couple of policies. Equalized funding between criminal defense or public defenders and prosecutors. There's been some experiments with essentially, when we deliver medical care to veterans, for example, there are situations in which they can choose between a veterans hospital, which is run by the government, or they can go to a private hospital and have that treatment reimbursed. We don't have anything like, or with a couple of exceptions, we don't have anything like that for public defenders, but people are experimenting with it. So why not let you go out and hire the lawyer of your choice, who the government will then pay? Not every, maybe not the whole rate, but at least compensate, as opposed to making you pick a public defender. I have a completely off the wall, and if you'll bear with me, I love this one, so I appreciate it, and I'll tell you about it. This is, if I had like $1 billion and I just wanted to play with like 20 or 30 million of it, I have this idea. Who's ever seen the movie Usual Suspects? Okay. You remember the Kaiser Soze character? This is a criminal so fearsome, so terrifying, that other criminals lie awake at night worrying that they might run into him one day. So my idea was to take a bunch of money and put together the most aggressive, terrifying criminal defense team. I was about to say white collar, but it's not white collar, just any criminal defense team. So basically a bunch of criminal defense attorneys that are like the A-team, like the best in the business. And then what I would do is I would have somebody monitor prosecutions all over the country, state and federal. And I would look for situations where prosecutors were taking the public defender they were up against too lightly. They're cutting corners, they're failing to produce discoverable material, they're committing ethical violations. And I would wait till the point where they'd gone beyond the point of no return, when they can't walk that stuff back, and then I would parachute in the A-team. And I would have the A-team burn that criminal prosecution to the ground, and I would pay a bounty for scalps. $1 million for every disbarred prosecutor. And I want those guys lying awake at night, wondering, worrying, is the A-team going to parachute into my case, because I've been messing around. The ones who are doing their job fine, and by the way, if you talk to a prosecutor, that's all of them, they won't have anything to worry about, because they didn't do anything wrong. But if there are any that were cutting some corners, and I've heard from my criminal defense attorneys, friends, that this may happen once in a while, if you're cutting corners, if you're screwing around, if you're violating your ethical obligations, then the A-team might parachute into your case, and you're going to get disbarred in a very public and embarrassing way. So join me in thinking outside the box. We can fix this problem, but we have to not get hung up on the idea that the way things are is the way things need to be. If all of us will think about what we can do to make it better, we can make it better, but we have to hold ourselves up to that standard. Thank you so much for having me down. And I have plenty of time for questions if anyone wants to.